So let's talk about one of the biggest, most dramatic events of the First World War. In late 1918, what was arguably the most powerful army on the planet just fell apart. I mean, Germany went from being on the very edge of victory to total defeat and revolution, and it felt like it happened overnight. So the question is, how? What really went down in those final crazy months of the war? I mean, just look at this. The turnaround is absolutely staggering. At the end of 1917, Germany was riding high. They'd knocked Russia completely out of the war, they controlled huge chunks of Eastern Europe, and they were shifting all these troops to the Western Front for one last knockout blow. Now fast forward less than a year, late 1918. The army's broken, the country is in open revolt, and the German Empire, well, it's not even a thing anymore. It's a mind-blowing reversal of fortune.
So yeah, that's the big question, right? How on earth did it all unravel so spectacularly, so quickly? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it's definitely not the one you might have heard about a stab in the back. The real story is what we're going to unpack right now. To really get why 1918 was such a catastrophe, we actually have to rewind a bit. Because the truth is, this collapse didn't come out of nowhere. The seeds of Germany's defeat were planted years before. You could say the whole war effort was built on a pretty shaky foundation. And this quote from the historian Holger Afflerbach just nails it. It perfectly frames the whole situation. What he's basically saying is that after the first few months of the war in 1914, an outright German victory was probably never going to happen. But a complete, catastrophic defeat like the one they suffered? No, that wasn't a given. That, he says, took some very grave mistakes. And oh boy, were there mistakes. They just kept piling up. First, the famous Schlieffen Plan fails in 1914, which meant they were stuck in a long, grinding trench war. Exactly the kind of war Germany couldn't win. Then you've got the disaster at Verdun, where they threw away hundreds of thousands of their best soldiers for nothing. Meanwhile, the government's a mess, pretty much a military dictatorship that's bungling everything. And the grand finale? Unrestricted submarine warfare. A total backfire. It didn't starve Britain, but it did manage to drag the industrial might of the United States into the war against them. So by the time 1918 rolled around, Germany was walking a tightrope with absolutely no safety net. But even with all that, Russia's collapse gave the German high command a glimmer of hope. They saw one last fleeting chance to win. So they decided to go all in, gathering every last man they could for one more massive all-or-nothing roll of the dice, the Great Spring Offensives in 1918. And make no mistake, the Allies were terrified. I mean, absolutely panicked. This quote from a top British general shows you the mood. He's talking about the very real possibility of the French army getting smashed, the British getting routed, and losing 1 million men as prisoners. For a hot second there, it really looked like Germany might just pull it off. So the offensive kicks off with a series of gigantic punches, starting with Operation Michael. And at first, wow, it's a huge success. They're smashing through Allied lines, advancing for miles. But a dangerous pattern started to show up. With every attack, they'd create these huge dents in the Allied front, but they never, ever broke all the way through. They kept failing to capture the really important targets, like the crucial railway junctions that would have paralyzed the Allies. And this right here, this quote from a German major at the time, tells you exactly what went wrong. The German High Command, the OHL, they got obsessed with the map. They were just trying to capture as much territory as possible, instead of focusing on the targets that would actually help them win the war. It's like they were chasing acres on a map instead of victory. And the price for this flawed strategy? Well, this one number tells you everything you need to know. Almost 1 million German casualties by the end of July. And these weren't just any soldiers. A huge number of them were the elite, irreplaceable stormtroopers who led the attacks. Germany was literally bleeding itself dry for land that, in the end, didn't matter. And behind a number that massive are countless individual moments of pure horror. This story from a soldier named Frederick Meisel really brings it home. He's caught in a gas attack. His own mask is broken. He rips the mask off a wounded soldier he had just bandaged, leaving the other man to die so he could live. That's what bad leadership looked like on the front lines. It was a descent into pure, brutal survival. Okay, so while Germany is busy destroying its own army, what are the Allies doing? Well, they're doing the opposite. They bent. They got hit hard, but they didn't break. And the crisis actually forced them to get smarter and stronger. And then they started to push back. Hard. So to see how fast things changed, you just have to look at the raw numbers. In April of 1918, at the height of their big push, the Germans actually had more soldiers on the Western Front. Not a huge advantage, but an advantage nonetheless. About 1.57 million to the Allies' 1.35 million. This was their window. This was their shot.
But that window slammed shut incredibly fast. Now look at this. By November, just 7 months later, the whole picture has flipped. German strength has been gutted by those failed attacks, dropping them to under 900,000 men. The Allies, meanwhile, are stronger than ever thanks to a flood of fresh American troops. They're up to nearly 1.5 million. I mean, the tables didn't just turn, they were thrown across the room.
And it wasn't just about manpower. By 1918, the Allies were crushing Germany in the technology and industry race. The numbers on tanks are just ridiculous. 800 for the Allies, and just 20 for the Germans. They had more planes too. But maybe the biggest difference maker was logistics. The Allies had over 3 times as many trucks. They could move troops and supplies with a speed the Germans, who were still relying heavily on horses, just couldn't dream of. So, how'd the Allies pull through? Well, they adapted, and they finally started working together. The crisis forced them to put one guy, the French General Foch, in charge of all their armies. They started sharing reserves so French troops could rush to help the British. And, crucially, the Americans were team players, letting their fresh troops plug holes wherever they were needed. It was all about flexibility and cooperation, 2 things the rigid German command just didn't have.
So this brings us to the final act of the tragedy. The defeat on the battlefield was bad enough, but it was matched and sped up by a total collapse from within. The German army wasn't just beaten, it was disintegrating. And the evidence for this is just overwhelming. We're talking up to 180,000 guys just walking off the job, deserting. Mass surrenders became normal. Almost 400,000 men just gave up in the last 3 months of the war. And maybe the worst sign of all, soldiers started attacking their own supply trains just to get food. When that's happening, you don't really have an army anymore. The will to fight was completely gone. And the Allies could see it happening. This British intelligence report, based on talking to German prisoners, makes it crystal clear. By the summer of 1918, literally everyone in the German army, from the privates all the way up to the officers, knew it was over. They knew they couldn't win. And hope is the most important weapon in any war. And for Germany, it was the final casualty. And man, the end came so fast, it would make your head spin. Look at this. Late September, Germany's ally Bulgaria collapses. Just a few days later, General Ludendorff, the guy who'd basically been running Germany, completely panics and tells the government to ask for a ceasefire immediately. Then, in late October, the sailors mutiny. And by November 9th, there's a full-blown revolution and the Kaiser is forced to give up his throne. The entire system just evaporated in a few weeks. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. Let's make a final call. When you look at all the evidence, the reason for Germany's defeat is painfully clear. At its very core, this was a catastrophic failure of leadership. And this is the most crucial point of all. Germany wasn't stabbed in the back by politicians or revolutionaries back home. That was a poisonous myth created later. The truth is simple. The German army was decisively beaten on the battlefield, period. It was beaten because of terrible generalship that gambled everything away, because of flawed political goals that didn't allow for a realistic peace, and because it was an exhausted army that was finally outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by a superior enemy. And that leaves us with one last chilling question to think about. The very generals who lost the war, men like Ludendorff, were the first ones to create and spread that stab-in-the-back lie, all to avoid taking responsibility. That lie would fester in German politics for years, and it helped fuel the rise of the Nazi Party. So you have to wonder, how might the entire bloody story of the 20th century have been different if Germany's leaders had just told the truth in 1918?